We tap together nicely.
Thank you.
I'll start. I'll start at the beginning, which for me was meeting a man who spent 44 years in an institution, sent there when he was 7 years old, came out, relatively old man. He was mentally retarded in an age when that was not conducive to much of a life. His name was Bill. He ended up working as a pot scrubber in a country club where my young wife, and we're talking about the early 70s now, was a waitress. And every night I would see this fellow's face in the window in the parking lot behind this exclusive country club where it was, I was not allowed to drive my 54 Studebaker up to the front to pick up my wife. I had to go around to the back because it was too old of a model car. But this man, Bill, whose name I later learned was Sachter, was perhaps the person who had the most profound impact on me of any human being other than perhaps my father. I got to know Bill at a Christmas party when the one night of the year when the staff or the inmates were allowed to take over the asylum or the country club. And we got the free champagne, the roving string quartet, the canapes and hors d'oeuvres, and we dressed up as if we were fancy members of this country club when in fact we were just the grunt staff. But there across the other side of the room I saw him, Bill, in the flesh instead of through this window every night where he had been waving to me for months. He was wearing a beetle wig. You know, those of you too young to remember the wigs, I can't forget. In the 60s, your parents would go off to a party and one of them would come home wearing a beetle wig. I don't know why, if there was alcohol involved or something. But Bill somehow had ended up with one of these wigs and he wore it religiously because underneath this wig was a very bald head, which I had been used to seeing the bald head, and now tonight I'm seeing the wig, but I can recognize that face. And I went over to him and he stood up and he said, "Buddy, I've been waiting for you." And thus began a very unlikely friendship between a 23-year-old kid and a 60-some-year-old guy. And along the way, I became a screenwriter. And what was I going to write about but my own experiences? And so I wrote a movie called Bill. It starred Mickey Rooney in the part of Bill, and a young Dennis Quaid played me, Barry. And I had no real intentions of being a screenwriter or a filmmaker or anything. I had simply written my story of the friendship with Bill just for my own sake and for my family and others. But it ended up a movie. I ended up winning an Emmy, and Bill, as it turns out, launched me on a career that would then reach another milestone when, after Bill had passed away, and I began to volunteer my time with other disability groups, I ran into a fellow who hails from Salt Lake City or nearby, whose name is Kim Peek. His father, Fran, was a chairman of the communications committee on a national committee for the Association for Retarded Citizens, which is later became known as simply the ARC. I bumped into his son, Kim, who was not institutionalized, but against the best advice of all the doctors in Salt Lake City at the time, which would have been the 50s, and instead was raised at home. But little was known about him, even by his family members, because he spent all of his time in his room looking at books. But as his parents said, he often was holding the books upside down, sideways. They really weren't certain what he was doing with the books other than the fact that he was, obsessed with them. Well, I'll just cut to the chase here. He wasn't just looking at these books upside down, but memorizing them with a 98.9% retention rate, permanent, some 10, 20,000 books, and that's not counting the phone books that he memorized just for fun. Out of this second amazing coincidence or meeting, kismet, whatever you might call it, tumbled out the movie Rain Man, which earned me this thing. Do you hold it, please?
Yes.
So this is what. This is what Bill brought to me and Kim brought to me. There was an Emmy that goes with it too, but I gave that away. As I did this, only because when Kim and his father came to visit shortly after Rain Man won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, and Screenplay, I'd had it for a year, I think, about. And the first week, it was on the mantle in the living room. And all the neighbors and friends and relatives came. And they all held it, and they all said how heavy it was. And they all gave their fake speech. They'd like to thank their mom. And everybody had a lot of fun with it. And then after a couple of weeks, it wore off. And then, as my wife said, this doesn't really go with anything in the house, So, and so I put it in my office on a shelf, and there it collected dust, and as my wife would remind me, spider webs for quite a while, until Fran and Kim came to visit one day. And when they left with the Oscar. Because it just dawned on me when after Kim had carried it around all day long, and not like most of us would hold our Oscar, but like this. How could I take it back, right? So, and he and his father then went on what would become eventually a world tour. It started with the elementary school in their neighborhood, the junior high school, then across town, then another state, and eventually they traveled to places like, Oxford, England, where Kim received an honorary doctorate degree from Oxford. That's a good place to get an honorary. But in doing so, they told their story of a father and a son and their triumph over the challenges presented to a person with autism and a savant-like mind that science has never seen before or since and likely never will again. I'll just briefly tell you a trip that my wife Bertie and I took with Fran and Kim to Monterey to the Nassau Research Hospital, where one day scientists decided to look and peek inside, no pun intended, peek inside what they knew must be a miraculous architecture of a brain, because the stupendous crunching power of his mind and his memory capacity was far exceeded anything in recorded literature. In fact, Kim Peek has been labeled a mega savant because there is no one in recorded literature that comes close to his memory skills. I was there when this CAT scans and these X-rays and all these things started coming into this room where the scientists, their lab coats were, and the first thing I heard was a word I can't repeat. But one of these scientists said, "Holy sh," and I'll let you, holy moly, that's what. And I didn't know what they were seeing because it's just a brain. I don't know much about brains, but I found out later. They said it isn't what was there, but it was what wasn't there. They were expecting to see a brain with sort of enlarged gray matter here or there, but they found an architecture that was stunningly different, unlike anything they'd ever seen. And at this point, it's when they told me, "Barry, Kim is probably unique in all of creation. There has never been a person, and likely never will be a person like this. And I'm thinking, yeah, he's my friend. So the movie Rain Man changed his life, my life, and in some ways everyone's life, because it was the first portrayal of autism, just as Bill was the first positive portrayal of mental retardation. And the Karen Carpenter story was the first portrayal of anorexia nervosa, and Lou Gehrig's disease on another movie. And I've been lucky enough to, through my 40-year career now, kind of be on the cutting edge without knowing it. Okay, that's the key. I didn't plan anything, and I still don't to this day. How I ended up next to this man is complete kismet too. And as it turns out, we've been shadowing each other in many ways. We're kind of twins in our own way, aren't we, Ferose? So I'll let you take it for a while.
Thank you. Fantastic. You know, I'm kind of having a fanboy moment, right? So thank you, Stephanie, for making this happen. Before I tell my story, I'll tell you how I landed up here, right? So this is fascinating because my next book, I was researching on my next book, which is called Givers. The first book is called Gifted. The next book is called Givers. And I've been studying the act of giving for the last probably 10 years. And I've been looking at unconventional forms of giving. It's not how much money you give and so on, which is the traditional form of the narrative around giving. And I'm like, I want to give an alternate narrative around giving. And after doing a lot of research, I've kind of identified like 5 or 6 traits based on the people whom I've studied. And one of my first insights is that it's not how much you give, but it's how much you are willing to give up. And somebody just, I just read about this story about the most traveled Oscar in the history. Right? It talks about an Oscar which traveled 3,000 miles and still counting. And I'm like, what's the story about? And I'm like, okay, wow, this sounds interesting. And then you go deeper, and then you realize, thousands, hundreds of people have won the Oscar, but there's only one man who's given it away. It's a classic example of what you're willing to give up, right? And that narrative stuck with me. So I went and gave a presentation. I built a presentation. I was talking about it, and I always talk about this guy called Barry Morrow. I don't know who this is, but seems like a good guy. Kind of fits into the definition of, in my mind, who a giver is. It's, as I said, it's not how many millions you've given up, but but what you're willing to give up. And as it so happens, I showed that presentation in one of my board meetings. I'm the chairperson of Specialist Turn. And my fellow Bill looked at it and said, oh, Barry Morrow, I can connect you to him. I'm like, wow, really? Okay, how does that work? And then after that, he said, by the way, on 2nd of April, there is a conference in Columbus, and maybe you can just come there, and I'll make sure that you get invited, and you can meet him. And I'm like, I looked at my schedule, and I said, you know what, shit, bad luck. Because on 2nd of April, I'm speaking at the United Nations, and you can't, once you've committed to the UN, it doesn't look good to say I'm not coming, right? And so I said, Bill, sorry, maybe some other time. 2 weeks back, the UN called me and said, Ferose, you know what, we are relooking at the agenda. We are toning down this year's event. We are focusing a much bigger event next year because it's going to be the 75th year of the formation of the United Nations. And we want you to come and speak then. And I'm like, thank God for that, right? This is like, I'm super happy I'm not having to speak at the UN anymore because I can meet my friend Barry. So here I am. And, we spent last 3 hours chatting outside, and we've spoken everything from giving to Gandhism to trusteeship to disability to world peace to Donald Trump. No, we didn't speak that, but but everything, right? So
and our family.
Yeah, and our families, of course. So I always say we are all actors in a series of coincidences. And the story that I'm going to tell, and I want to tell this upfront, is I don't want to take any credit for what happened. Because, as I said, we're all just actors in a series of coincidences. And I feel I get too much credit for what happened, and I feel sometimes guilty of taking that much. But anyway, I'll tell you the story. The story goes back to the year 2010. I was based in Bangalore in India. And I had married my college sweetheart after 10 years of literally parental feud. I'm a Muslim and my wife is a Hindu, and that's a perfect recipe for disaster. Especially if you're in India, a Hindu-Muslim wedding is like not done. But after pursuing my girlfriend for 10 years, my parents just gave up. They said, you're getting too old now, so just get married. It doesn't matter whom you're getting married to, just get married, right? So I got married. I got, at that moment, I got selected at a board assistant at the highest level. I work for a small company called SAP. It's a $100 billion company. It's a very tiny company. I don't know how many of you have heard about SAP, right? Many of you have heard about SAP. Good. So I worked for SAP. I worked with a board member. And then one fine day I was asked to lead the largest engineering division in SAP's world, which was in Bangalore. And this was a company called SAP Labs, their Indian division with 5,000 engineers. So here I am, married my college sweetheart after 10 years of struggle, got this dream job. I was seen as the youngest CEO of a global multinational in India, so all the newspapers carried my photographs. And an incredibly good-looking kid, 18 months, right? I'm like, wow, this is perfect life. Nothing can go wrong. And you start feeling a little bit, you start feeling a little cocky about yourself. And the newspapers want to write. And then one day, what happened was I went for a dinner with my boss, and we went to a dinner, both the families. And then he looked at my son Vivan. At that time I was 18 months old, and he called me to a side and he said, Ferose, why is he looking at the same video for so long? And he's kind of playing it in that rewind mode, right? He keeps watching the same video and he's like only looking at this. And by the way, when you call his name, he's not responding. I'm like, but that's okay. He's probably just focusing on the video. And then he said he's also not making eye contact. And I'm like, but he's just 18 months old kid. I mean, he's not interested in making eye contact, so forget it, right? And anyway, he said, you know what, I would advise you to get him checked for something called autism. And I'm like, what is autism? He said, don't tell this to your wife, she'll get panicky, but I would suggest you have a look. So I went home, and I did tell my wife, Vishal, his name was Vishal, he said, he's just asked me to check if Vivan has autism. And she went wild, and how can you do that? He's perfect, and he looks so good, and blah, blah, right? I'm like, yeah, don't worry.
And he's the most beautiful child. You showed me pictures. Really, the most beautiful child. I just take my word for it.
Yeah. So I went home, I did a Google search, what is autism? And then I looked at what are the symptoms of autism. Doesn't respond to names. And I'm like, okay, check box. Then he says, doesn't make eye contact, check box. Is non-social, check box. And I'm like, and in my mind, I'm like, shit. There goes my perfect life. And then, after that, for 2 months, me and my wife went for various therapists and doctors, and there weren't much awareness about autism in India. And finally, of course, after 2 months of regular checks, the doctor called both me and my wife to his room, and you said, you know what, your son is mildly autistic. And he said, mildly, said, you don't know, it's too early, but he's on the spectrum. And we both went to the car, my son was sitting behind, we drove down. For the whole distance for an hour, we didn't speak to each other. And I went back home, I went to the bathroom, locked myself in, and cried for 30 minutes. And I'm like, that's the end of my life. And what followed was, for 3 months, I went through severe depression. I went through denial. And then magic happened. I got this phone call from my mentor. Her name is Dr. Kiran Bedi. There's a very famous movie made on her life called Yes, Madam, Sir. She was India's first IPS officer. She's been very close to me, has really been like a family member. And she called me and said, Ferose, and she called me beta. Beta means son in Hindi. Said, what happened? You haven't spoken to me for like months. And I just broke down. And I said, you know what? Vivan has been diagnosed as autistic, and I don't know what to do. This is unfair. And then I heard a pause for like a few seconds. And then she said something that kind of, switched my life upside down. And she said, Ferose, most people spend their entire life not knowing what their purpose is. You're incredibly fortunate. The purpose found you. And she said, you are in a position of power and influence. You are smart, you are connected, you have the financial means. Don't spend the rest of the life just taking care of the one. You should take care of others who can't take care of themselves. That should be your purpose. See this as your purpose in life. And you know what? That from that moment of seeing the world as unfair, being in a mode of denial, suddenly I started looking at the world as completely different. And then I went back to office next day like a completely different person. I told it to my team, as you know, as Vivan has this problem, I don't know what to do, but we'll figure it out, right? So one thing led to the other. I did a lot of research on autism. But here is what really happened. I started speaking to parents. And every parent that I spoke to told me just one thing. Said, if there's one problem that we are worried about that keeps us awake at night, it is we don't know what to do with these children after we are gone. That's the lowest common denominator. That's the only problem that we bother about. And I'm like, okay, I get that, but why are you saying that? And I remember a father whom I had a conversation with tell me this, which really broke my heart. He said, you know what, Ferose, my wish is I live one day more than my child. And that broke my heart. How many parents on earth can ever wish for seeing their own kid die before them? And I said, there has to be something fundamentally flawed if we have got to a point where society asks for parents to wish for that. And so I'm like, I have to do something. This is just not done. And everybody told me the same thing, that many of these kids are smart, but they're not independent. And I'm like, so why are they not independent? Well, they're not independent because they can't do a job. I'm like, they can't do a job? Is that the problem? No, they can do a job, but the recruitment systems are all flawed. I'm like, why are they flawed? And then I realized they were telling me something very profound. They said, all recruitment systems in the world, they call themselves as they select people. Actually, they reject people. Because 99% of all recruitment systems reject people. So why are they calling it a selection system? It's a rejection system, not a selection system. I'm like, wow, that makes sense. I do that all the day. Right? We get hundreds of resumes and we select one. So is it a selection system or a rejection system? And then he said, the problem is the two qualities that companies look for are good teams players and good communication skills. And these are two skills that people on the spectrum don't have. They're not necessarily team players because they like to live in their own world. And the second is many of them have challenges to communicate properly. So they get eliminated from corporations. And I'm like, yeah, it makes sense to me now. And guess what happened after that? Somebody just connected me to a person whose name is Thorkel Sonner. He said, you know what, this guy had the same problem, and he said, if nobody else does it, I'm going to do it myself. He started a company where he said, all I'm going to hire is people on the spectrum. And I want to prove that you can make business sense out of this. And I'm like, this might be a crazy guy, so I have to really go and check him out, right? So I took a flight to Denmark, from Bangalore to Denmark. I said, I'm going to check what this guy is doing. And I was blown away by what he was doing. I paid my own money, took my assistant, I said, let's go and figure out what he's doing. And I'm like, if this makes a lot of sense. So in his company of 100 employees, 80 of them were on the spectrum, 20 of them were project managers who were managing them. So it seems to work. Came back, and I said, you know what, let me try this out. So I told my HR people that, you know what, I'm going to hire 5 people on the autism spectrum. And the first thing they said is, are you smoking? Are you kind of on drugs or weeds? Or, this just doesn't make sense. You know what you're saying? I said, yeah, I know what I'm saying. This will never work. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to hire them anyway. So I hired...
So you were smoking?
Yeah. So I hired the first 3 employees at SAP Labs, And these people hadn't gone to college. They had no university degrees. They knew English. They knew how to browse. And we said we will see if they can perform and do functions. Fast forward, in 18 months, we proved with numbers and data that these 3 people were better than my engineers. But it took us 18 months to get there. And then what happened is just a series of coincidences. Forbes journalist heard about this, wrote to me and said, I want to know what is this thing you're doing, right? He wrote a piece which is called How Autistics Triumphed at SAP Labs. You can still Google it. It's still one of the most, an article that went viral. Mothers across the world still write to me in that comment saying, thank you for giving hope. I had no clue, but he wrote that article, went viral. He got an award for writing this piece. Then he said, you know what, I didn't even do anything. I just transcribed whatever you said. But anyway, that won an award. I got selected as a young global leader. I got invited to speak at the World Economic Forum, and then somebody just showed in the morning Carolyn Casey. She's a very dear friend. So I got invited to speak there, and you get 5 minutes to pitch an idea that can change the world. So you get 5 minutes, but you have the entire world looking at you, right? And I gave a speech about how it makes business sense to hire people on the spectrum. So this is not about charity, it makes business sense. Guess what happened? The next day, CNN carried my entire speech verbatim. My CEO read it. What's the chance that my CEO of the company reads the same article? And he called me into the breakfast meeting and said, have you been doing this? I'm like, yeah, I've been doing this for 2 years. I didn't tell anyone. And that's the testimony of a great CEO. He said, this is a brilliant idea. If you can pull this off in India, which is, by the way, the hardest place to pull this off, because there is no schools, no special eds, nothing. Do you think we can pull this off at SAP? You're saying it makes business sense. This also is the right thing to do. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. The next week, he sent the chief diversity and inclusion officer to Bangalore and said, please go and check, this guy is really telling this, or is it a fake, or is it right? Go and check this out. And so I have the head of diversity and inclusion coming to Bangalore, like, I want to see these kids on the spectrum, and do they really work well? Fast forward, we made a decision on that week that SAP will hire 1% of its global workforce with people on the autism spectrum. At that time, we were 65,000 people. One decision, and we did this in the month of June, that 1% of our global workforce will be people on the autism spectrum. That is 650 people, okay? But they had no clue how to write the press brief. They're like, I don't know what this autism thing is, and you've done something. So they said, Ferose, can you write the press release? Because we're going to announce this at the largest technology conference, 30,000 people. But anyway, nobody's going to read this because it's all about technology. So, we'll announce it. I wrote the press brief. My assistant who had come with me to Denmark said, Ferose, are you sure this is 1% and not 0.1%? Because maybe there's an error in the decimal. 650 looks like a big number. I said, don't ask. Just do it. I mean, once the press brief is out, we have to do it. Anyway, so don't ask too many questions, right? So on Wednesday, in the month of May or June, we make this announcement at Sapphire in Orlando that SAP will make 1% of its global workforce with people on the autism spectrum. And nobody picked up that story. Like, okay, yeah. On Sunday, the chief diversity and inclusion officer calls me and said, our phones have not stopped ringing since that. And said, we have no clue how to handle it. CNN, BBC, everybody says, this is the most amazing announcement any corporate has ever done in the history to propagate the idea of inclusion. Since then, since that announcement, 2013, we've had more than 2,000 unique media stories about autism at work. This has given more media coverage to SAP than any product release put together in the history of SAP. They say it has touched 7.2 billion people around the world. 7.2, that's like the whole entire universe. And guess what? It started with a kid called Vivan. Isn't it amazing?
Qantas had a similar reaction to Rain Man, because in the movie, it was the only airplane that Rain Man would have flown if it had been at the airport. because it was the only plane that had never crashed. And I got to fly free to Australia whenever I wanted to for a while there. It's amazing. But, you know, we've been on parallel tracks. I'm quite a bit older than you. So maybe you are my shadow, but you're catching up, shadow. And we're from completely different worlds. An engineer, a businessman, a ne'er-do-well, a writer, you know. And yet, when we shared our stories earlier, we've met all the milestones almost in exact step. And I don't know where we go from here. If Lance, you wanted to get questions, or if we just keep rambling, I will never shut up.
Yeah.
Just, you know. So if you
I'll
No,
just
he's
add,
not. He's not lying. They'll keep talking.
I'll just add two things which I kind of stopped abruptly. But what happened after SAP's announcement is many corporates started doing the same. I have personally spoken to at least 50 companies across the world who've started their Autism at Work program. In 2016, it became a Harvard case study. We were invited to the United Nations by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to really ask other corporates to make similar commitments. JP Morgan, HP, IBM, across the world, more than 100 companies have made similar commitments. So it's now become a movement, right? I mean, and people often ask me this question, Ferose, what was the business plan that you had? And I'm like, I didn't have any. I was incredibly stupid. That's it. I didn't think why it wouldn't work. That's it. And just one thing led to the. I must confess that we were incredibly lucky that things just fell in place. We had a great CEO who saw the power of a good idea. It's hard, by the way. It's not easy. I think people, SAP has hired 150 people on the spectrum already. We've given internships and fellowships to another 150. We are learning in the process. But I think we've moved the needle, at least by a little small percentage, and I think that's all we can do.
Well, you have flown on the same wings that I have, but in the corporate world, where mine is media, film, television. They're stories. They're personal, anecdotal stories that and I am the first to admit that it took great luck for me to meet these people because they transformed my life. People look to me and say, you've transformed their lives, and it's definitely a two-way street. But what are we going to do next? That's what I want to know.
There's such amazing stories. I know we can spend the next, as I said, 2 hours. And there's one story which I want you to share, Barry. I know I made you cry, and I'm not getting any sadistic pleasure out of doing it again. But I think it's such a profound story. And you have to share that because it's about your daughter in the ICU, and then Bill comes and you see magic happen.
Yes, and the reason I don't talk about it much is because it raises all kinds of questions about faith and religion and miracles, and I don't have answers to any of it. I only have what happened. Our 11-month-old daughter was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, and the spinal fluid, they said, was so milky that they took me aside and said, prepare for her funeral arrangements, and spinal meningitis. And she had her own room in the pediatric ward, and this little thing with her head shaved now, her curls gone, connected to these electrodes and life-saving gizmos, and it was noisy and things were rattling, and it was 48 hours of her in a coma before the nurse told me that a man claiming to be child's grandfather has been waiting downstairs to see her. And I said, well, that's impossible because her grandfather is 350 miles away in Minneapolis, and I just spoke with him, so I don't know what you're talking about, and I couldn't be bothered. And but the nurse came back, another time and said, he says he knows you and he knows your names. And I said, well, what does this person look like? And they said, well, He's wearing kind of bib overalls. He's carrying a lunch pail, and he's wearing, and he has a beard. I said, "That's Bill. How did he get here? He doesn't drive. He doesn't read or write. He doesn't know how to take buses to this hospital, but he found his way." And so I went down immediately, and I said, "Bill, I'm so sorry. I just haven't had time to contact you." And he said in a very adult voice, in a very different voice, "You should have called me first." So we went upstairs, and he walked in the room, and he had this very officious sort of tone to everything he was doing. He even walked briskly, as if he had some business to conduct, and then that was going to be, over. And he walked into the room, and then he stopped and looked around at all this stuff, and he couldn't even find Zoe. And then he did, in this little crib, and he fell to his knees. And to me, I was right behind him. It looked as if I had just shoved him to the floor. And he was an old man, so he didn't, he wouldn't have done this at purpose. And some force inside of him or outside of him or together pushed him to the ground so he could pray. Now, just to know Bill's background, which he didn't know until I became his conservator and went through 50 years of records to find out that he was, among other things, Jewish, which he didn't know, but had lived most of his life outside the institution, going to Catholic Mass or Baptist church. And then once I reacquainted him with his Jewish roots by just taking him to a Hillel house and saying, "This guy would like to find out more about Judaism." He brought all of that together in one prayer, which I will do a fake bad version of, but with his head bowed, his hat on, and the wig under the hat, Bill said, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed ding ding ding." And he would fracture every prayer. And then he went into some sort of Hebrewic sounding, "Yaosi wohail, Yaosi, down behold, Yehovah, and have mercy. Amen." At the end of his prayer, he had taken off his cap and his wig. If I were to tell you why he felt compelled to wear the wig, you would be reduced to tears. It goes back to things that happened in the institution. So for him to take that off was basically, as I say, getting naked. And then he got up, brushed off his hands. "Okay, where's his elevator, buddy?" And I took him down, and he was, again, very kind of brusque with me. It was just like, "Job done. I prayed. I'm going home now." I said, "Well, Bill, thank you so much. I mean, that prayer, I know God heard it." He said, "See ya, buddy." Elevator doors closed. The second they closed, from down the hallway came a scream. And I knew she was gone. And I ran as hard as I could, and I got there, and everyone was hugging because she was awake. She's 42, has 2 children. She's a school teacher. She also teaches English as a second language. She was supposed to be blind and deaf and retarded if she'd lived. She was the most beautiful girl, next to my wife. And when I asked Bill later, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Oh, buddy, the good Lord loves everyone, but you got to bring the power. You got to bring the power." So I took everything off to bring the power. Sorry. That's a hard one to tell, but I still don't know what to make of it. Um, Bill never claimed any credit. He is just a conduit. And that's what I was with Rain Man. I didn't do much for autism, but the movie did. Bill did too. He'd been long gone before Rain Man came. That was just the next milestone. I'm looking for the next one too. I mean, there's got to be one more. The third time's a charm, right? So I have a feeling it's going to be something that you and I do.
Thank
But anyway, yeah, I cried again. Sorry.
you. Yeah, fantastic. Amazing. I think two things about Rain Man that very few people know, and I think I want to kind of lift up the spirit a little bit,
Please.
Barry. Have the fun stuff now. You said that the casting of Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman will not work because one was 25 years old, the other was 50 years old. Dustin Hoffman was 50 and Tom Cruise was 25 when they were taking that role. And how could they be brothers with 25 years of difference? But magic happened. And you didn't see the shooting of the entire movie except on the last day because that was the writers' strike happening. So throw a little bit of light on that.
Well, it was 1988, and it was the longest strike in the Writers Guild history, and of course that's when Rain Man, the movie, gets made. So I could not cross picket line, or I could have, and I would have gotten beaten up. And so I did go the final day of shooting across the picket line. The strike was still on. I didn't care. Nobody could, accuse me of like collaborating on a movie at that point. What was the main point of this?
That you saw, you said.
Oh, yeah.
Work, but when you saw them coming down.
Yes. So initially, when I found that's right. So I was the one instrumental for bringing on Dustin Hoffman because this is prior to the strike. He had read the script. We met, had several meetings, and he committed to the picture. But the other role had not been cast. Originally, the script was sent the same night to two clients at the same agency, Dustin Hoffman and Bill Murray. And the agency was two big stars, but the agency was thinking that Tom Cruise role would go to Dustin Hoffman, and Bill Murray would play Rain Man. But they didn't designate on the cover letter to either person which role was for whom, and Dustin Hoffman read the script the same night he received it. Bill Murray didn't. Dustin Hoffman called and said, "I'll do the picture, but I'm Rain Man." And so Bill Murray, I don't even know if he ever read the script, but he lost out the role. All right, so now who's going to play, the role that Tom Cruise ended up with? Well, studio informed me, and they said, "What do you think? Tom Cruise, it'll bring in the younger audience and everything else." And I said, "I don't think it's going to work. I mean, Dustin's 50, Tom's 25, they're brothers. Even in my family, with 6 children, there's 20 years from the youngest to the oldest. That's a lot. 25, it's stretching credulity, and they don't look that much alike, and except they're both short." And but nobody knows that because the camera makes you big. And I don't know what they do with you. Maybe a smaller screen would help. Anyway, then so I didn't see the movie until it was in a rough cut. And normally, a writer, you'd be watching it made, and you'd see dailies and all of that. And so I sat back and watched the movie for the first time. It wasn't the finished product, and then I saw them come down that escalator together in those matching suits, and I said, "Oh boy, was I wrong." These are brothers. They look alike. They're connected. The umbilical cords are still there. I mean, so I just proved myself wrong once again, but in a nice way.